I'm pleased to welcome back to the podcast my guest today. He was the Chief Administrative Officer for the Region of Waterloo from 1991 to 2004. He had a long history of involvement with the Region of Waterloo, starting as a senior transportation planner in 1973. Before becoming the CAO, he moved up through the ranks at the region, holding the positions of Director of Planning, Director of Transportation, Director of Facilities, and Commissioner of Engineering. He was involved in some of the largest and most important projects in the development of the region, including the early planning stages of the ION. Today, however, we're going to talk about a significant environmental crisis that faced our region, and one that the region is still dealing with today. I'm pleased to welcome back to the Old Grey Mares podcast, Gerry Thompson. Gerry, welcome from the left coast.
Thank you very much.
So, Gerry, I've had you on a few times because you've been in the center of a lot of very interesting things from the history, the past of the region, like Toyota, the ION, even for example, the Research and Technology Park up in Waterloo. And, it's always interesting to have you on to come and talk about these things with us. Today, though, we're going to talk about the environmental crisis that occurred in Elmira. And as I understand it at the time, you were a resident of Elmira while this was going on. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. As was Ken Sealing, the chair.
Yeah. So two of the people that would have been front and center on this issue were actually living the experience.
Exactly.
So when we get into talking about, water boiling or water bottles or dermal or, issues, those are all things you personally had to deal with as well.
Yes, that's both Ken and I did have to deal with that. And of course, our friends and neighbors from various aspects of our lives were very much involved in it. And we had to deal with them. Some were on the side of the public health measures that we took, and others feeling, I guess, that their livelihoods were threatened as employees of Uniroyal Chemical were concerned about their economic future. Well, so the clash of objectives, which boiled over at times to, some contentious matters.
Yeah. So, in one sense, it's good to know that the people that are dealing with the issue can have some sort of direct empathy with what's happening. But at the same time, you're going to the grocery store, or your wife or your kids are going to the grocery store or in the community, and they're going to hear about some of this stuff. Probably not always the good.
Well, just as an example, my neighbor across the street, who was a wonderful person, was a major scientist with Uniroyal in the chemical engineering. So, right across the street, you've got we all meant well, but there's a conflict of interests. Yeah.
So no doubt a very difficult time, something we sometimes don't think about. For politicians, especially at the municipal level, when you're dealing with your day-to-day events and affairs, it's not like you can go, you're not living outside the community, you're directly in the heart of the community, which is in one sense good for knowing what's happening and what people are experiencing, but at the same time can lead to some difficult, contentious moments.
That's true. That's very true.
So I was going through your book and I saw in your book, you have this line. It's the line goes, "The world changed for us on November 11th, 1989.
That's right. It did.
And what was the significance of that date?
Well, it's significant in and of itself, but it's particularly significant to me because I had just been appointed Commissioner of Engineering, Chief Engineer for the region, just prior to that. And we were dealing with a lot of issues in the engineering department surrounding cost overruns and time delays and all the kinds of things that you encounter in an operational setting. And there were a lot of things to be fixed. So I was consumed with that. So this came, as you just mentioned, on November the 11th, 1989. And at that point in time, we received a message from the Ministry of the Environment, who had the responsibility at that time to do well testing throughout the province. So it was a regular event that they would test wells, particularly groundwater wells. Well, they're all groundwater wells, but test wells throughout the province, ours included, on a regular basis. So as of the testing on the 11th, they reported to us that they had discovered a chemical in the water called NDMA, nitrosodimethylamine. And it was determined very quickly that this particular chemical was highly carcinogenic. So that sparked, obviously, an immediate concern. And so we worked with the ministry for a little while, and I'm talking about a few days here, not months, trying to get a handle on what this stuff was, and but more concerningly, how long it had been there.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's one thing to phone somebody up in a municipality and say, "Oh, by the way, in your groundwater system, we found this terrible chemical." Well, the next question is, well, how terrible? And then the second question is, I mean, it just didn't disappear on the weekend. How long has it been there, and what are the potential public health consequences of this stuff being in the drinking water?
Yeah, and Gerry, I just want to ask you this: this testing by the MOE, was that the result of, like, this regular testing was the result of some other incident that occurred? Because this incident was pre-Walkerton, right? Walkerton happened after this situation.
Considerably after it, actually. Yeah. No, this was not prompted by anything other than a regular testing regime.
Okay.
And that's why, as I say, since it wasn't prompted by anything preceding the discovery, you do have to ask, well, how did it get there, obviously, and how long has it been there? Because this chemical was cited to be highly carcinogenic, and was as we traced this thing a little bit, we found it was fairly proximate to the Uniroyal Chemical plant in Elmira, so they are a number one suspect from the beginning. That
didn't come about, like, right away. You're wanting to know these other issues, and what was the MOE telling you about the seriousness of this contamination?
Not very much. I mean, with all due respect, they seem to be completely inept. They really had no idea, no real suspicions with respect to where the contamination was coming from, or the degree to which the plume had extended itself in the aquifer. They had been dealing with Uniroyal Chemical, before that, I guess, as part of their normal mandate as the Ministry of the Environment. Right. And there were a lot of conversations that went on there that were obliquely referred to as we begin to delve into the subject, which made us wonder whether the suspicions should have been raised a lot earlier, just based on the circumstantial evidence, let alone the scientific evidence, and how did that go? We never really got to the bottom of all that. That was a bit of a clouded mystery, and it was maintained as a clouded mystery.
Well, when you say clouded mystery, what are you referring to? The cause, or not the cause? I mean, the cause was identified, right? We'll get to that.
It was the mystery was around how long had this been known? How long had this been a suspicion on the part of the MOE? What were the conversations with the Uniroyal Chemical officials? What was the background to this? We began to ask questions.
So this was before. So what conversations were happening with the MOE and Uniroyal, for example, before the region was informed?
Well, there had been conversations, and that's about all I can say, because we never really got to the bottom of all of that. We didn't do an investigation, into that aspect of it. We were more consumed at that point in time with the situation as it existed on the ground. Exactly where is the contamination coming from? What is the scientific nature of the contaminant that's there? What are the potential health consequences, and what are the remedial actions that we will have to take? Those were preoccupied.
Yeah, for an issue like this, did the region of Waterloo have the staff or expertise necessary to deal with this sort of issue at that time?
We were geared up to a certain extent based on general responsibilities for water supply. We had established, as part of our operations center in Cambridge, we had established a very sophisticated laboratory that was capable of doing some in-depth research with respect to both biological and other potential contaminants. And
Right.
we had got into the mass spectroscopy business on a very serious level. Excuse me, and we had 2 or 3 lead scientists in our lab who were extremely well qualified. So that wasn't established to deal with the Elmira situation. It was
No, but you had that though. You had those resources
to be able to monitor water quality in a general way. But we weren't scientifically flat-footed. We did have resources. We had to figure out how to employ those resources to the current problem. But
let me ask you this. This is kind of interesting because now I'm just wondering about the jurisdictional issues here. You've got the MOE, which is provincial.
Yeah.
Ministry of the Environment, identifying the problem and testing these wells. And you've got the regional Waterloo, and because, why don't we just mention for a second the source of our water for regional Waterloo?
Well, Regional Waterloo is the largest community in Canada wholly reliant, or it was at that time, wholly reliant on groundwater. We had a huge groundwater system, and the hydrogeology of our area suggested that was the appropriate way to go. Plus, we didn't have any other sources really. So we were getting more sophisticated in hydrogeology. We hadn't. At that point in time, we actually hadn't even hired a hydrogeologist because we didn't anticipate something of this nature,
sure,
exact nature. But we had built the laboratory facilities, and we had a plan in place to deal with hydrogeologic questions more in depth, but we hadn't got there yet. So we were relying on the Ministry of the Environment's testing and their laboratory capabilities in Toronto to keep the water supply system safe from that respect.
Right, and just before this fateful November 11th date,
Yeah.
you were working on the water treatment system. Wasn't that being updated or upgraded or improved in the region? That was a big project you were working on at the time.
Well, we had, because of the groundwater doesn't necessarily place itself strategically in exactly the right place.
Right.
So in order to maximize our use of the groundwater, we developed over time what we called the Tri-City water system, which linked the 3 cities together so that we could manage flows of groundwater, supply of groundwater, within the system. It was all interrelated and computer controlled.
Gotcha.
Oh, we're pretty sophisticated in that way.
Yes. So now you've got the ministry telling you about it. So I guess you're initially, following their lead on this, like they're the source of information.
Well, from a jurisdictional point of view, the Ministry of the Environment did have the lead. I mean, they were the agency responsible.
Yeah.
Not that we didn't have an interest, but they in fact were the agency responsible, and they were the people who purported to have the scientific ability to deal with these things. And they did have very sophisticated laboratory facilities, no question.
So if they're testing, and how often are they testing? Is this annual, quarterly? How often?
No, it was more like quarterly. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, maybe 4 times a year. Yeah.
So wouldn't they have had the historical data to tell you when and what was the progress of this chemical in this well?
Well, exactly. And that's what prompted the question after we found out what they had found out. How long has this been going on? I mean, if you tested these wells 3, 6, 12 months ago and didn't find anything, and now all of a sudden you find contamination at a dangerous level, what's the history behind this? I mean, were you simply missing the information that you needed to make decisions with respect to the safety of these wells, or what was going on? And there was no clear answer to that. A lot of obfuscation and sort of backtracking, but no answer.
They didn't release to you the documentation, the historical documentation.
Well, they could give us the documentation that said 3 or 6 months ago there was nothing there. But obviously there was something there because it doesn't develop overnight.
And when you first found out about it, was it at a dangerous contamination level? when they first
Yes,
informed you about
it
it?
was judged to be a dangerous contamination level. Yes, that's right. We very quickly hired epidemiologists, hired a firm called Ecologic, I should say. And
Yeah.
the person responsible there was a Dr. Ron Preacher. He was the chief epidemiologist. And so we started to delve into the health implications of all of this.
Well, let me just
with
step back for 1 sec, and
Yeah.
why don't we explain what this chemical was?
Well, it was a byproduct of the production of Agent Orange. Uniroyal Chemical had a contract with the U.S. military. They were one of 7 sites somewhere to have a contract to produce this chemical, this defoliant. And so the byproducts contained the chemical compositions of Agent Orange, plus whatever other byproducts were there that made up the NDMA. They buried the byproducts in barrels adjacent to the plant, basically the back 40, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They
And
just
that's,
dug a hole and buried them.
and these barrels were what, like aluminum, steel barrels? What were they?
I think some of them were metal and some of them may have been plastic. But the bottom line is that they leaked. It was an inappropriate, I mean, it was probably an illegal way to dispose of chemical waste.
Yeah.
But obviously very cost effective from the company's point of view.
And when was this? So this is 89 when we're finding the problem. What is this, like the early, like 72, the late 60s? What time frame are they producing?
Well,
is it
during the Vietnam War, so the 60s, yeah. And thereafter. And a lot of the discussions, I think, with the MOE, and this is conjecture to a certain degree, surrounded the Uniroyal's practices, environmental practices. But the MOE seemed to be, they could talk a lot, but they never did anything. And Uniroyal was not prompted to do anything on their own behalf. So the problem built, the barrels leaked, the NDMA leached into the groundwater table, into the aquifer, and plumes of this contaminated water reached out into the various well locations that we had in Elmira. There were about 4, and we developed another one at the south of Elmira as part of remediation, an attempt to remediate anyway, or restore some groundwater supply to the town a little bit later. And it wound up being contaminated as well.
Okay, and that's what you all learned eventually. But in the early weeks, days, weeks, who did the region have to step up and take charge on this? I mean, when did the communication to the community start?
We were dealing with an individual whose name is Hardy Wong, and he was I think a manager level, not a director level, within the Ministry of the Environment. And he was responsible for this water testing program that I'm describing to you. And he was the person involved in discussions with Uniroyal Chemical before this about environmental practices. But I said they generated no action. So the MOE had the jurisdictional responsibility, but it became very clear very quickly that the MOE had neither the ability to deal with a situation like this or the will to deal with it. And so there came a time very early in the process where we said, just step aside and let us do it, because you're not doing it. And maybe somewhat almost amazingly, they did step aside. I mean, we kept in communication with them.
Right.
But we said, we're going to undertake the work. We're going to undertake the scientific work to refine the detection levels through the mass spectroscopy procedures. And we'll do all of this work, and we'll settle the bill later. Right now, there's a job to do here, and it's got to get done in a hurry.
So you started doing the measuring, the testing, and the measuring on your own.
We did, and we started off with detection levels, which were the best the MOE could do at the time of, I think something around 1 parts per 100,000 or something like that. They couldn't go beyond that. We took it down to parts per million, and eventually to parts per trillion. So we actually made scientific history in doing this, but nobody had done it before. And the reason we were doing that, we were trying to establish the cutoff level in terms of contamination.
Right.
If you find something that's dangerous at parts per 100,000, that's
Yes.
one thing. If you
Yep.
go to parts per million, does it disappear, or become acceptable? Or
Right.
where's the cutoff? Because that determines what you have to do in terms of remediation.
And you see that often with environmental assessments, and they'll say, okay, this property has so many various chemicals, here's the levels, but there's certain levels that are acceptable versus levels that are not acceptable.
That are not, exactly. And actually with NDMA, that exactly what you said is true. At the same time, nobody really knew what the levels were. Like, for certain chemicals, you'll come down to a parts per whatever, and below that it's deemed acceptable. In the case of NDMA, there was no such scale.
So
we had
no jurisdiction. No jurisdiction in North America, for example, had to deal with this issue?
No, we were the first. We were
Wow.
completely on our own. And
just back to the MOE for a second, wouldn't they have been monitoring the activities of Uniroyal prior to 89 from the time they were making Agent Orange on through, or was that not top of mind?
Let me rephrase your question. Should the MOE have been monitoring Uniroyal's activities during this period and doing something about whatever they found? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because you always hear, oh, back in the day, this is what we did. And then at some point, obviously, we get into more stringent environmental monitoring. But I guess there's this transitional phase where in certain situations, it was far too lax and led still to problems.
That's right.
Okay. So who at the region took charge, Gerry?
Who in the region? Well, I guess me.
As the commissioner?
We had a director of water supply who would otherwise have been intimately involved in this, but for a variety of reasons, he left us. And so there was no director of water supply at this instant. And I took over the role in addition to being the chief engineer. And we began to put a team together to deal with this. First of all, not necessarily first of all, but one of the elements, of course, was the scientific capacity with our laboratory in Cambridge at the operations center. We hired CH2M Hill. They were an internationally recognized environmental company who had been involved in contamination issues around the world, actually. And Earl Shannon was their lead engineer on that. At the same time and we hired also Gardner Roberts to be our legal counsel. At the same time as that was happening, Uniroyal, of course, was hiring Conestoga Rovers, who had gained a reputation for something similar to in the Love Canal in Buffalo some years prior to that.
Yeah.
They were a well-established Waterloo company, which was kind of ironic because we had to hire somebody from outside the region to defend ourselves against a Waterloo company. And they
that right, Gerry, right there is the difference. Like this company, which is making the Agent Orange, maybe had an inkling they had a problem, so they're ready to pull the trigger on a plan.
Oh yeah,
while the region got confronted with this like out of shock until you were able to get around to getting what you needed. A lot of the big players were gone already.
That's right. They've been scooped, so to speak.
Yeah. Very common to grab experts.
Uniroyal hired a bunch of, and that's a pejorative way to put it. They hired a team of Bay Street lawyers to defend their.
We'll get to the legal stuff eventually. So at the time, though, was it known that it was Uniroyal when you first found out, or was this something that you eventually had to determine through investigation and testing?
Well, the geographical circumstantial evidence was overwhelming to anyone. I mean, the Uniroyal Chemical was right there, and we knew that they made carcinogenic or dealt with carcinogenic materials. Basically, they were a fertilizer company in Elmira. I mean, Uniroyal is a big company, but in Elmira, they were producing, at the point of this all came to light, they were producing fertilizer. They had ceased to produce Agent Orange by this time. Of course, the Vietnam War was over. But so I mean, yeah, it didn't take a tremendous intellect to identify Uniroyal as the probable culprit.
But did the barrels, like, were they unearthed? They come to light? You got to check? You got to see that with your own eyes, or what was that all about?
Well, there are people who work long term for companies. They have a lot of historical experience, and it came to light from long term employees from Uniroyal that they used to bury this stuff out here,
Uh-huh. The anecdotal evidence.
So the picture starts to come together. It gets more robust as more actors are included, more information comes to light.
So did the region have to hire some investigators, or how did you gather that evidence or information?
We didn't investigate their on-site situation. It was documented. They actually admitted it. I mean, at early on in the process, there had been stuff buried at this. We didn't need to establish that.
Okay.
It had to be dug up, and it was excavated, but the damage was done.
Did they ever? I don't know if you know this. Like, how many barrels of this carcinogen there was?
Oh, I probably knew at the time, but I can't recall now. It was a lot of barrels.
Yeah.
It was that's where their waste was going.
Wow.
That was it. Wasn't being shipped to somewhere else.
Okay, so the region gets this information November 11th, and then what do you say? Hey, Elmira, you can't use the water November 11th.
Sorry.
What did the region do about water usage then for Elmira? Like, was it immediate? You can't use the water, Elmira, or what was the? No,
there was quite a scramble to gather information and put resources in place to be able to gather yet further information. That was a process that took days, not weeks and months. Like, we acted very quickly. And the people that were involved in this were actually working around the clock 7 days a week. I mean, it was very intensive effort. We had distributed a lot of information to the residents by hand, by public meeting, and otherwise, letting them know the situation we were dealing with. We didn't have enough information to cut the water supply off on day one. We very quickly accumulated enough information to realize that we had, a serious health problem. We originally thought, given the level of contamination and the level of scientific knowledge we possessed at day one, that the carcinogen might be absorbed dermally. And
okay, and just to explain that, when you say dermally, you're meaning water contact through the skin.
Exactly. Yeah. So with that in mind, it's a pretty serious situation. Essentially, you'd have to evacuate the town. I mean, not only can you not consume the water, you can't take a shower or a bath or whatever. And so it turned out that it did not dermally absorb, but at that point in time, we didn't know that it didn't. So we were faced with the logistics and implications of potentially evacuating Elmira.
Yeah. So that consideration obviously must have been early on. Like, are we talking in the first few weeks?
It was, yes.
And you have an interesting story about investigating evacuation plans.
Yeah, we started to think through what might be involved, and the logistics of such a thing are actually pretty complicated. So, it seemed to us that it was an emergency worthy of getting some federal help on. So we decided that if we actually had to evacuate and provide alternative places for people and all that goes with it, the Army would be a useful resource. So I called Ottawa, spoke to the general who had responsibilities in this general area, and I said, this is what we're faced with. We may have to do a massive evacuation. Can you give us any advice or help? And the general said, well, when you figure it out, let me know. So I didn't call back.
I was just thinking about that time. Didn't they evacuate Mississauga or something on a train derailment?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Chemicals. There's an old Hazel McCallion story there. But we're talking about now, the population of Elmira was approximately, I don't know what it was.
7,000.
7,000.
About
What about farmers and wells and those sorts of things? I guess you had to check all of that as well.
Yeah, if it had been let go, the plume definitely would have reached into the agricultural areas around Elmira and could potentially have contaminated private wells in that area as well. The plume did not.
But when you say if it would have been let go, how do you contain it? Once you know about it, how do you contain it?
Pump and treat.
So you had to initiate that right away?
Very quickly, yes. In order to deal with the plume of contamination, you have to know where it is. And you can't tell that from walking around on the surface. Right. So we had to drill a number, I can't remember how many, but a large number of test wells all over the place to be able to determine the extent of the plume's migration. And as I mentioned previously too, the aquifer on the surface, well, you can't see the aquifer on the surface, of course, but it doesn't follow the contours of the land that you see on the surface. The aquifer is right. A distinct animal itself. Yeah. People think, well, water flows downhill. Yeah, but not relative to the surface. It doesn't. It could be
right. Yeah. A hill on the surface could be a valley underground.
In the aquifer. Yes, exactly. So we had to map all this stuff. Once we knew where the plume was, or had a much better idea of where the plume was, then we did start to pump and treat. And we treated with, fairly on, chemicals like chlorine don't touch it. We used ultraviolet.
So you had to establish a treatment process. And when you say pump and treat, I mean, you can say it, but to actually do it must have been a significant undertaking.
Well, it had never been done either. so with ultraviolet.
What did you do?
On a scale. So it was that was another scientific breakthrough. How do you do this? And I mean, things don't just go whoosh. It's a slow migration, but it's a progressive migration. If you go long enough, it'll spread and contaminate even further areas than we saw at that time. So we began to look at remediation, and we drilled a new well at the south of Elmira, which was beyond, at that point in time, beyond the contamination plume, to buy us some time for water supply for the town. And there were a couple of wells as time went on. This is all based on an evolution of understanding and scientific ability, which wasn't there in the first hour. It takes time to build that up. Yeah. But there were some wells at the north end as well that eventually we were able to put back online for limited periods based on the levels of contaminant we were finding in those wells. So we cobbled a temporary system together, right? Because we came pretty rapidly to the conclusion we were going to have to replace the water supply for Elmira altogether.
And we'll get to that in a sec, but I just want to ask you, was the contamination worse in the south end of Elmira versus the north end of Elmira? Was it
at the beginning noticeable? It was worse. At the beginning, it was worse from the north.
Oh,
yeah. Now that well, but it was migrating in different directions. I mean, it's again not a neat package. The well we drilled at the south end of Elmira was we deemed to be within practical limits when we first drilled it as part of a temporary solution.
Right, that was a solution, but that was a solution to provide water for Elmira?
Yes.
Okay, but when you're talking about but when you're talking about pump and treat,
yeah,
where are you pumping the water into?
Further up, closer to the Uniroyal plant.
Yeah, but how is that done? What are you pumping it into? You're just pumping it into a tanker, or what's going on?
It went through a process, and it would be pumped out on the surface after it was treated at least. And
but when you pump it, I'm just trying to visualize this for a second. When you're pumping it out, what are you pumping it into?
You really can't know where to pump it, but basically into the sewage system. But I have to tell you too that the pump and treat solutions that we came up with ultraviolet was not at a scale that would actually be a solution for the water supply. And we quickly came to that conclusion.
Right.
So, as I said, we drilled this temporary well at the south of Elmira, knowing it was only temporary, that the plume would eventually get there, but we were buying time. And we were trying to develop a pump and treat technology to implement at scale, but we never made it. I mean, we developed a technology to treat it, but not at scale.
Not to the scale that was needed for this size of a problem.
Obviously, we needed a pipeline.
Okay, and I'll get to that in a sec, but I just want to ask you now. So the people of Elmira who are impacted by this, you realize there's no impact, a dermal impact. Obviously, you can't ingest it. So people are what? They can still shower, or what? What is it they can do with this water?
Well, we determined, as you said, that there was no dermal absorption, so you could take a shower. So you might be infected, but you wouldn't smell. So what we had to do was provide alternative water to supply. We set up water stations all over the place. There were places you could go for, the large jugs of bottled water, both in Elmira and in Waterloo and Kitchener. So we had people could avail themselves of clean water, but not in a handy way, at all. It was still a great inconvenience, and obviously not anything like a permanent solution to the problem.
So you're supplying them with water, bottles of water, and there's water stations that you're probably pumping some good water into. You create the well.
That water came out of the Tri-City water system.
Right. And you're creating the well. You created a well in the south end that's outside of the plume or the danger area, we'll say. But you need a longer term, more permanent type solution for water supply for Elmira.
Because it was evident that any remediation technology that might be employed would be tens of years in actually achieving.
Right. Yeah, it's going to take decades to resolve this problem. And clearly we've seen it has been decades.
Yeah.
And no end in sight.
That's right. So, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so you realize you got to come up with a permanent or a better water solution to deal with this. And so how did that come about?
Well, we determined that given the way the plume was advancing over time, that there was no solution in terms of groundwater in Elmira, no permanent safe solution. We had the Tri-City water system in place, and we recognized very quickly that the solution to the problem on a long-term basis would be to build a pipeline from Waterloo to Elmira up Highway 86. I mean, it was, from an engineering point of view, it's a pretty straightforward solution. You build a pipeline.
Right. But
the Ministry of Transportation had a policy that didn't allow major utilities on highways. So we had to get around that, which we did. We dealt with the London office of the Ministry of Transportation, and and an old colleague of mine, Andy McConnell. We worked on projects together and managed to override that policy provision.
Could they make that decision at their office, or did it have to go to the minister?
No, I think that was made in London at the regional office of the ministry. Yeah.
Okay.
And of course, time was of the essence.
Absolutely.
And obviously, the Ministry of the Environment had already been sidelined. They were at this point just spectators.
Yeah. So you were just keeping them updated on what was happening.
Yeah. Yes. We didn't pussyfoot around. We were pretty direct in our communications.
Did you let them know you weren't happy?
Pardon?
Did you let them know you weren't happy with their performance? So tell us about putting this pipeline together. Did it take a while to get together, or what was involved with that?
Oh no, it happened very quickly. Once we had secured permission, I guess I could say, from the regional offices of the Ministry of Transportation, the design and construction went very fast. I mean, it is a very straightforward project.
Yeah. So once that pipeline was in place, then the people of Elmira, their water system could be hooked into this pipeline that came from Waterloo.
They were then drinking the same water as Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge.
Right, right. Now, what about people with wells in the area?
Yeah, some of those were impacted. There were private wells even within the plume area, the area of Elmira, and those wells were. My recollection is that they were shut down with the agreement of the people that were involved. They didn't want contaminated water either, and there
Right.
was the option of being hooked up to the municipal water system, which happened in a few cases. It wasn't a large number of cases, but there were a few.
But what was Uniroyal's participation like during this time?
Their chief scientist was David Ash. Wally Ruck was the president of Uniroyal Canada at the time, and Wally played sort of a hands-off role. David Ash was very much involved. Their position was defensive. The thing that concerned them the most, maybe the only thing that really concerned them, was legal liability. David Ash was our principal point of contact, and I know this doesn't sound well, but he showed no empathy for the situation or the concerns regard to public health. It was all
that was your impression.
Interest. That was my impression. Yeah, and David and I had some calamitous conversations.
Oh, like over causation?
Yes. Causation, and what was the company going to do about
it? It's almost unbelievable to think that they would argue causation.
Well, they argued everything they could argue. They would argue that NDMA was not as carcinogenic as we said it was. They would argue, well, it couldn't have been them. This couldn't have happened. That couldn't have happened. But I mean, they went for broke on the defensive.
Well, I guess the question one might have is, let's say it was leaching into the water supply for a few years. Is that even conceivable?
Oh, yeah. If it hadn't been detected when it was detected, if we hadn't done the things that I'm describing to you now, sure, that contamination would have continued to spread.
Right, but let's say it was detected when it was detected. I mean, you never did find out how far back that went, though, correct?
No, we never did.
So it could have been.
The records didn't indicate anything prior to the notification that we
right.
had.
So I guess we have to go with the MOE records that they found it within 3 months of the last time they tested or whatever it was.
Right. I mean, you could conclude that is not a defensible position, but you could.
Yeah, but you know what? That's early detection, which is positive. I guess to the other side of it, I was just surprised though with the Uniroyal position on causation, trying to say it wasn't as dangerous as people thought it was.
That and I mean, it sounds ridiculous now to say, but they defended their disposal practices, and anything that attracted liability to them, they would challenge.
So a scientist suggested that their disposal practices were correct.
No, they claimed it.
Yeah, they're scientists, right?
Well, David Ash was their yes.
Yeah, David Ash was their chief scientist.
David Ash was their chief scientist.
He's a scientist, and they were suggesting that what they were doing was correct.
Well, there was, we were overblowing the situation that that their disposal practices over the years hadn't been what we determined they were in the end. And, all of those things were contentious. And, David had a doctorate in chemistry. He was not a slouch. He was a very, very intelligent man, but he was a company man.
Yeah.
And whatever was good for the company was fine with David. It turned out.
So while you're scrambling to get a handle on all this and coming up with a water supply solution.
Yes.
I guess you're all building a case here as well.
Oh, yeah. We were building the case through our consultants, CH2M Hill, and also Ecologic, our epidemiologists. We were building the case, plus our own investigation, through our own laboratory and through our own engineering staff. All of these together with our lawyer, Robert Taylor, who was the lead counsel for Gardner Roberts we hired
Yeah.
from Toronto.
So I'll ask you more about that in a moment, but I just want to step back for a sec and ask about the
Sure.
communication plan or what have you that the region utilized during this time. I mean, you're a resident, Ken Seeling's a resident in Elmira. What was sort of the approach that you were taking in terms of communication on this issue?
We decided very quickly, almost instantly, that all of our communication on this matter would be totally open. We would hold nothing back whatsoever. And we didn't. We went door to door. Ken Seeling went door to door talking to people, as an example. We held public meetings, press conferences. We shared everything. And as a result of that, although people were quite concerned, and there was the, to sort of adversarial positions between different people in the town, we gained public trust. We had absolute public trust. There was nobody saying, you guys are crazy. They believed us, and they believed that we would ensure on their behalf that things were done properly. So it was a exhaustive public communications program.
Yeah,
and it was undertaken right on the ground, and it was very successful in that I think it ameliorated a lot of concern.
right.
People realizing that this wasn't being swept under the rug. This was being taken very seriously.
Yeah, and that's like if you don't have good communication right off the hop, I mean, fears, misinformation.
That's right.
Just builds and sometimes entrenches in a community, and it's hard to overcome that later on.
Yeah, yeah.
And
so it was a good program.
Yeah, and you mentioned you had someone who was an employee of Uniroyal living across from you. What was the general mood in the town with respect to those that worked at Elmira or at Uniroyal and those that didn't?
I don't think it wasn't a belligerent kind of situation. It was a situation on the one hand where those who were not employed by Uniroyal were obviously very concerned about the health implications of all this. I think that the Uniroyal employees were similarly concerned about that, but they were also concerned. They had an additional concern with respect to the security of their employment. So they had a double whammy in the sense that their employer was really under the gun, and also they were drinking the same water as everybody else. So there were little temper flare-ups now and again, but nothing really all that serious. Sometimes it's spilled over into the neighborhood, or it spilled over a little bit into the playground. The kids would talk about this, and for my own part, I mean, it was impossible. I mean, I was working 7 days a week, literally all hours, so I was never home. But around the dinner table, it was almost impossible to not talk about these things.
Yeah.
And I've got my two girls who are there, and they were sworn to relate nothing that was ever said at home. And they didn't.
That would be tough. I mean, that's a very significant issue in a community. I can't think of anything more more drastic, more concerning than your water supply, right? I mean, that's a basic life aspect there. So, yeah, I mean, that would be quite the conversation. So, just on water, and we've mentioned that groundwater is a major source of water for the region.
Yes.
When you go through an experience like this, sometimes you hear these concepts like, the pipeline from Lake Huron or something.
Yeah.
And we have the Grand River right beside us, I guess. I don't know how that comes into play, but was there discussion about looking at these other alternatives? Yeah,
it does come into play. You asked earlier about where would this have gone had it not been detected and allowed to, continue on.
Right.
The same contamination that we're talking about here was flowing into the Canagajig Creek, which abuts the Uniroyal property. Canagajig Creek is part of the Grand River watershed.
Oh.
So it would begin to migrate into the watershed as well. So anyway, we did look at alternatives. We looked at a lot of these alternatives actually when we were doing the master water supply strategy just a little bit before this. So it wasn't a new topic in that sense. And people suggested, as you mentioned, the pipeline to Lake Huron. And as I've pointed out to others over the past, the pipelines you think you put it up, you hold the map up and north is
Right.
up, runs downhill, right? So just put the pipeline in and run through it. But actually, the topography between here and Georgian Bay is not quite that regular.
Right. So you got that working against you. But at the time, at the time that you're dealing with this, so I mean, the general view was if we get this under control, our groundwater and continue to protect it, the aquifer, the groundwater would be able to supply all the water we as a community need in this area.
Yeah, well, that was a concern. The pipeline was not in the cards. However, from a quality point of view and a quantity point of view, we did investigate alternative sources. And one of the things that we investigated, water supply is a matter of peaks and valleys. I mean, it surges and then the demand drops off. It surges again at different times of the day. So you need to be able to balance the flow. And one of the ways to do that during periods of low demand was to pump water into the aquifer, called artificial recharge, and store that water in the aquifer, which is largely porous rock, and then pump it out when you need it at a peak time. So that's one way to manage the water supply. And we did that. And we got to be very recognized experts in doing that.
Okay.
The other thing that you mentioned was the Grand River. And again, we pumped water. By that time, we had pollution in the Grand River fairly well under control. I mean, the Grand River had been a pretty dirty river in its industrial days. But we, to the point where we could pump water into the aquifers adjacent to the river, again, artificial recharge, but using river water.
Right.
Take it out further down the river, pump it across the south of Kitchener to our new Mannheim water treatment plant.
Oh, so wow.
We pump it out of the river.
Yep.
Pump it into the aquifer, take it out down the river, pump it across, let it go through settling ponds and sort of a very, very primary treatment.
Yep.
Then manage the flows, again, peaks and valleys, pump it across the south of Kitchener to Mannheim. And then that went into the Tri-City water study. So that was a substantial augmentation to our supply.
That must have been exciting times coming up with these concepts.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, I was really lucky. I had from an engineer and planning point of view, a terribly interesting career.
Yes.
But there's a wrinkle in everything, because in the river water, then we discovered a substance called cryptosporidium.
Mother Nature, don't mess.
It was a biologic contaminant. Now we were able to remove the cryptosporidium through our treatment process, but we became an expert on that and wound up doing consulting assignments in Minnesota and California for the Americans.
Wow. Let me ask you, Gerry. Where was the GRCA with respect to Elmira? Were they involved at all with respect to that?
No, not in an operational sense. They were certainly kept in the loop.
Right.
And the GRCA has always been a great source of information and help for this area. It is one of the signal grand conservation authorities, which I understand that their current premium is kind of defanged a bit.
Okay, now, and defunded.
Which I think is a wrong thing to do.
I know, defanged and defunded. Okay, let's talk about, getting our pound of flesh here. What, in terms of the region and Uniroyal and the MOE, how did that go?
Which part of it, Rob? I'm sorry, I missed.
This is where we're bringing our claim against Uniroyal now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we launched a suit against Uniroyal. We did finally settle. The money was primarily for remediation.
Right.
Not for damages, but for remediation. And the deal there was about 40 million. But of course, you have to remember, that's what $1 million was worth $1 million.
Yeah. What was the negotiations like with Uniroyal during that process? Were you involved in that?
Yeah, very legalistic. It was yeah, very legalistic.
You're telling me a story about the time you met with David Ash at your office.
No. Well, as I mentioned, David and I had some unusual conversations, but we were still in the Marsland Center, and David came to my office. I think he might have asked for the meeting at this particular time. And So he was in my office. My secretary came in with a tray of tea and said, "Would I like a cup of tea?" And by this time, I had it with David, and I said, "No, he wouldn't like a cup of tea. He's leaving."
You should have asked if he wanted a glass of water from Elmira.
We had some other meetings that involved our lawyers on both sides as well, and a Uniroyal in Connecticut as well, and they were contentious meetings. We were very much on opposite sides of the case.
It's interesting that today, if something like this were to occur, you'd see a class action lawsuit being started on behalf of residents against.
Yes, probably.
Back then, though, there was nothing like that, though, was there?
Well, I legally, I suppose there would have been that opportunity, but no, we didn't. It was never talked about, actually.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. You're not aware of any claim brought by any citizen.
No, not at all. No, it didn't go that route.
And were you aware of anyone that suffered as a result of this carcinogen in the community?
The answer to that is no. We launched longitudinal studies through our public health department to track the health of people in Elmira that were willing to participate in our long-term studies. At the time, we couldn't establish a direct link. I mean, cause and effect within the time frame that we were dealing with. And of course, longitudinal studies are for the very purpose of examining what happens over the longer term.
Right.
And I'm not current. I'm simply not current. Yeah, but we did launch those studies.
Yeah, I guess it's something that you wonder about. So the damages that were paid by Uniroyal were for all the work that the region had to do with respect to reestablishing the water supply, monitoring, other remedial work, that sort of thing.
I mean, at the time, or in that time period, we did notice we followed different cases of cancer that people presented with. And, right. Circumstantially or emotionally, you could say, well, that's linked to the drinking water.
Yeah, very interesting. And Gerry, we're going to wrap up, but what's your sort of lasting thoughts on this particular issue?
Well, I think it was in a broad sense, it was a wake-up call for Ontario with respect to industrial pollution and how it could be handled. And the Walkerton crisis did come a few years later. And because of the experiences we went through, although the nature of the contamination was different in Walkerton than it was in Elmira, a lot of the way you would approach a problem like this, even in terms of public communications, were really instructive. And so a lot of the things that we did in Elmira, I think, were adopted as practice. So there was a very long-term implication in that sense. And but these things ebb and flow politically. You go through a period after a crisis like this, and the restrictions and the monitoring and all of that ramp up, and then you have somebody that comes along and says, "Oh yeah, this environmental stuff's getting in the way of development."
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we'll end on that point. Gerry, listen, thank you very much for your time today and sharing with us your firsthand knowledge on this very important moment in the history of the region. All the best to you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Old Grey Mares podcast. If you have any ideas for stories or people you would like us to interview or reach out to, please feel free to contact us. And thank you again.